Hey guys, Turk here. I hope you're having a good one. Over the past few weeks, I've been playing a whole lot of Starfield, Baldur's Gate 3, and I just started getting back into CS2. And last week, we took a little bit of time diving into frame generation technology. In my spare time though, I've been keeping my ear to the ground, and I had to make a video about the Switch 2's potential performance. Word on the street is the Switch 2's performance is just as good as a PlayStation 4. That sounds good and all, but man, times have changed from the PlayStation 4's prime. And given the track record of recent releases on that archaic machine, what does this really mean in terms of a modern console? But according to a Reddit post on the Switch 2, Final Fantasy VII Remake looks and runs like a PlayStation 5 game. What does that even mean? Does it hit the 4K resolution that a PlayStation runs at? Does it even run the same quality settings? Is it upscale, DRSing, or what version of the game are they even running? For most gamers, the Switch is a popular, straightforward console, but the Switch has a lot going on under the covers, even more so with a potential successor. In today's video, I wanted to dive into these rumors and answer how powerful is a PlayStation 4? Can a PlayStation 4 even handle native 4K Switch content? What's the deal with Final Fantasy VII? And what exactly does Nvidia bring to the table? But here's an exciting twist. Have we seen this device before? First, I want to set the stage and talk about how powerful is a PlayStation 4. Times have changed since 2013. When the PlayStation 4 launched, we were looking at games like Assassin's Creed Black Flag, Battlefield 4, the original version of Warframe, and many sports games had their yearly installments. And that was almost a decade ago. With the PlayStation 5 hitting the scene, this ancient machine needs to support games like Cyberpunk, Metro Exodus, The Witcher 3, and Doom Eternal. Over that decade, PC hardware has considerably improved its potency and efficiency, and games require even newer and faster architectures just to be compatible. Yet the PlayStation 4 was able to keep up thanks to a common architecture and optimization from developers. Here on the channel, I like to look at console performance from a PC perspective. Many consoles use PC hardware variants, though optimizations and customizations from Sony, Xbox, and Nintendo help refine that spec into a formidable performer. I started this video looking at AMD's HD 7850 GPU. This 2012 GPU claims the title of the PlayStation 4's GPU in different circles on the internet, but it has its deficits. Rocking the first revision of AMD's GCN architecture, it only has 2 GB of GDDR5 VRAM and 16 compute units running at 860 MHz. Compared to the PlayStation 4's GCN2, 8 GB of shared VRAM and 18 compute units running a little slower at 800 MHz, it's not exactly a good fit. I originally started testing this video with an HD 7970, and even that card struggled with the latest titles. I guess it's back to the drawing board. What other GPUs perform similarly to a PlayStation 4 without deviating too far from the architecture, overall performance, and are compatible with modern title textures? Enter the RX 560. You might have seen this card a few times here on the channel. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there are other devices that claim to be just as fast as this bad boy. The RX 560 equips the GCN4 architecture, 4 GB of VRAM, and 16 compute units boosting up to 1.275 GHz. Though on paper, this might be too good compared to the PlayStation 4, but for an equivalent PC GPU, as you'll soon see, we are pretty darn close. The GPU is only half of the equation, and its CPU has 8 Jaguar cores. I don't have one of those just lying around, but I do have an aging dinosaur of that same era, the FX 8350. The 8350 shares similar era-defining performance issues that nearly bankrupted AMD back in 2012. Though the system isn't an exact one-for-one with PlayStation hardware, it is analogous to how a PlayStation 4 equivalent PC would perform here in 2023. Since the system isn't a direct one-for-one with the PlayStation 4, let's calibrate it against known settings and resolutions collected by Digital Foundry. I've created a playlist with many of these games' details, so if you want to learn more about console equivalent settings, that playlist is really worth a watch. But to highlight our performance targets, we're generally looking for 1080p resolution and medium to high settings sprinkled with some ultra textures. As these are late generation games, many of them will be targeting 30 FPS. Let's start with our cross-generation favorite, Grand Theft Auto 5. On the PlayStation 4, it targets 1080p resolutions and, surprisingly, only 30 FPS. Dialing in Xbox One X settings and collecting data during the car chase scene, the RX 560 maintains a solid 57 FPS for its average frame rate, but 1% lows come strikingly close to 30. This drop is likely due to CPU architecture limitations, but still, it's a positive result. Next is Doom Eternal. id Software's popular franchise runs at 1080p with dynamic resolution set up for 60 FPS. If our frame rate drops below that limit, the game will reduce the resolution to compensate. Digital Foundry found that in this title, dynamic resolution does trigger quite often with a lower bound of 720p on the Sony console. During the first map, the RX 560 hits 44 FPS on average at 1080p, and it sits comfortably at 68 FPS at 720p. Knowing our DRS limits, we are in the ballpark of the 2013 console. Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the capstones of visual quality for the base PlayStation 4, targeting 1080p in a broad spectrum of settings. Robbing the store clerk and hopping on our horse in Saint Denis matches the performance issues highlighted in Digital Foundry's video, confirming an average of 31 FPS with dips to the mid-20s. The Witcher 3 has changed quite a bit compared to 2015, but if we use the same targets and settings, it still looks really good. I'll be using DirectX 11 here along with 1080p, 30 FPS, and mostly medium settings. Riding our horse into town from our first Griffin encounter, we averaged 31 FPS and 1% lows slightly below that. Novigrad will perform poorly with our current CPU, but at least we're on the right path. Shadow the Tomb Raider follows suit and showcases that CPU limitation nicely. Using normalish settings and the built-in benchmark averages 30 FPS. Though it's not in-game gameplay, it's reasonably representative of DF's findings. Metro Exodus is a similar story to Doom Eternal. On the PlayStation 4, the target resolution is 1080p, though it does enable DRS down to 540p. On PC, we don't have access to that luxury, and at 1080p, we are just shy of 26 FPS on average, suggesting that we should be engaging DRS in the Taiga region. Changing our resolution down to 720p confirms this, and we are averaging just about 37 FPS, though 1% lows still hit the low 20s. Cyberpunk's 2.0 update won't make it to our PlayStation 4, but I've got it ready for my setup. Digital Foundry finds its target resolution to be 900p, with DRS dropping to about 720p. But despite the 30 FPS target, the game never feels fluid and regularly floats in the mid-20s. At the medium quality settings and 1080p with FSR set to performance mode, I see very similar results, around 26 FPS on average. And if I decide to use 900p as my output resolution and FSR set to quality mode, V is cruising Night City around 24 FPS. With render resolutions floating between 720p and 540p, this performance is similar to Digital Foundry's results. Though it's only 7 games, I believe our RX 560 and FX 8350 match a PlayStation 4's expected performance in modern games, resolutions, and quality settings. So, could a PlayStation 4 handle Switch games rendered at 4K resolutions? I've covered Switch emulation a few times here on the channel, so let's throw Yuzu at our simulated PlayStation 4 console. Let me be clear, emulation with Yuzu is by no means an accurate one-to-one comparison to how a Switch actually performs. But given the accuracy of the emulator and our system's performance, it's at least a good first shot of whether if it would even work. For the uninitiated, the Switch primarily runs games in either 2 modes, handheld or docked mode. In handheld mode, most games will run at an output resolution of 720p. When docked, games will typically bump up to 1080p. As always, it's game dependent, so let's fire up Breath of the Wild. In handheld mode and my window set to 720p, performance isn't great, hovering just below 20 FPS. This might seem like an L, but let's take a closer look. Currently, our GPU fluctuates between 22% and 100% utilization. Our GPU is just hanging out and indicates a clear CPU bottleneck, preventing the game from running at its targeted 30 FPS. We see the same result if we change to docked mode and increase our window to 1080p. Frame rates are still the same despite the increased resolution and more consistent utilization. Even if we change the internal scaling to 2 times, we only start to observe constant GPU load at 4K resolution. On a Switch 2 in Breath of the Wild at 4K, we can confirm that this GPU solution is up to the task. But if this isn't convincing enough, is there another game that can give us a better feeling of Switch performance that doesn't rely heavily on the CPU? I've got just the game Metroid Dread. On ZDR, Samus runs at a fluid 60 FPS in both handheld and docked modes on the RX 560, so let's double the res. Handheld mode bumps up to 1440p, and we start to see the frame rate fluctuate slightly. It's still completely playable, but now we're starting to see the GPU and CPU of this system starting to falter. Switching to dock mode and frame rates do fluctuate between 40 and 60 FPS. Overall, I'm pleased with these results. Despite running in emulation and on a processor not known for serviceable emulation performance, we still hit pretty close to the rumored performance in Nintendo first-party titles. Up to this point, it's pretty clear that we should be able to get PlayStation 4-like performance, but the PlayStation 5 is a lot more powerful. Well, Final Fantasy VII Integrate is different. Usually, PC games allow you access to a bevy of options, but with Final Fantasy, rather than having a vast array of settings, Square Enix focuses more on the experience. Sure, we can tap into shadows, textures, and the amount of characters, but Final Fantasy Integrate mainly allows gamers to select a resolution and frame rate. The phrase, like a PlayStation 5, seems to fall flat in this settings black hole. If you choose 4K output and 30 FPS, you're effectively running PlayStation 5 settings. The magic sauce in this mode engages DRS to maintain that target frame rate. So if your gameplay dips below 30 FPS, the engine will render lower to compensate. That means we really have no idea what that leaker is talking about. However, let's look back at the original Reddit leak. This aspect has a few more details. Upon further inspection, the claim is while in docked mode, the Switch 2 performs like a PlayStation 4 Pro. Now that's an entirely different ballgame, so rather than stick to our RX 560, let's upgrade to a PlayStation 4 Pro equivalent GPU, the RX 580. And sure enough, 4K 30 FPS runs perfectly on the same setup with all of the settings turned up. This confusion means that this part of the leak is a little bit less relevant than some of our emulation and PlayStation 4 equivalent performance has led us so far. Now that we have a taste of what PS4 performance looks like, and we can confirm the PS4 could run Switch titles at 4K, do any of these numbers look familiar to you? About a year and a half ago, I picked up that RX 560 and I compared it against our trusty Steam Deck. In that video, I determined the 560 was about 10 to 20% faster than Valve's handheld, but at higher resolutions like 1080p, the RX 560 outperforms it by a more considerable margin. You probably know where I'm going with this. Is there another handheld that's roughly 10% faster than the Steam Deck? That's right, the ROG Ally. Rocking the AMD Z1 Extreme processor, this handheld runs 1080p reasonably well, so let's see how it stacks up at 15 watts compared to our PlayStation 4 configuration from before. With the same settings, resolutions, and FPS targets as before, let's start with GTA 5. At 1080p, we're noticeably slower than the RX 560, but our average frame rate is above that 30 FPS cap, and 1% lows are right on the money. Doom Eternal still shows lower than hoped 1080p performance, but remember, we should be using dynamic resolution scaling. We are comfortably above our 60 FPS target and 720p target resolution. Red Dead Redemption 2 on the Ally shows similar struggle bus symptoms as the RX 560, though it's only slower by a few frames. The Witcher 3 is also a couple of frames slower, though we're still in the same ballpark. It's the same story in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. 1080p runs at 27 FPS, but within striking distance of the PlayStation 4 target. Metro Exodus again shows we need DRS to keep a steady frame rate, but even at 720p, we're lining up with expected PlayStation 4 DRS targets. Last is Cyberpunk. We lost the 900p resolution thanks to the ROG Ally's display, but we did gain 3 frames from running at 1080p, which is upscaled from 540p. Running the numbers puts the ROG Ally only 4 frames behind our simulated PlayStation 4, or roughly 10%. And well, would you look at that? Precisely how close the Steam Deck was. But I need a bit more convincing. How about emulation? Let's crank Breath of the Wild back up to 1440p. Again, that's handheld mode running with a 2 times internal resolution. And would you look at that? At 15 watts in the same area, we're hovering between 20 and 28 FPS. Bumping up to 4K with docked mode, we see the same result as the RX 560, 20 to 28 FPS in the Grand Plateau area. Clearly, the updated processor and graphics architecture are better suited for emulation, and at 15 watts, we're off to a good start. Can we get the same result with Metroid Dread? Unfortunately, the Ally at 15 watt just can't handle the additional resolution of 4K at a locked 60 FPS. This is similar to the 560, but the experience is much smoother. We get fewer drops into the 40s, and Dread runs comfortably between the upper 40s and 60s. Since we already effectively have a next-generation Switch in our hands, what does a Switch successor bring to the table? Nvidia is well known for their high-end GPUs, their AI technology, but most importantly for this video, their experience working with Nintendo. With Nintendo sticking to Nvidia for their next handheld, there are tremendous amounts of improvements in store. First, there have been a lot of improvements to the ARM CPU architectures and performance. Though details on what Nvidia is cooking up for Nintendo are sparse, we do know that there are ARM developers like Apple making blazing fast CPUs. Single-core performance just continues to improve. That aspect alone is critical for these types of native titles. More important, though, is an updated GPU architecture. The Switch utilizes the Maxwell architecture, similar to GPUs like the famous GTX 980. Though impressive at the time, these past 9 years have been massive for Nvidia. The Switch successor looks to be using a hybrid of the Ampere and Lovelace architectures, which embrace many of Nvidia's latest accelerator and AI-oriented hardware tech. Though it's still unknown what aspects are available, you can guarantee Nvidia has some software tricks up its sleeve. The most prominent trick is DLSS, or Deep Learning Supersampling. This technique is similar to AMD's FSR upscaler, familiar to current handhelds, but DLSS is significantly better at upscaling from lower resolutions. In a previous video, I found that DLSS in quality mode can bump a GPU's performance by 19%, or from a different perspective, it can increase a 50 FPS game up to 60 FPS. And that is only with the quality mode. We still have balanced and performance mode. If you want to see how deep that rabbit hole goes, hit like on this video so I'll know you'll want to see it in action. But it doesn't stop there. The Lovelace architecture includes one critical component that I bet Nintendo will love to exploit, and that's DLSS 3 frame generation. In my DLSS 3 video, which most of you haven't seen, upscaling plus frame generation can increase frame rates by nearly 50%. Again, that's only with quality mode at 1080p. Frame generation has its criticisms and its issues, but if you want me to go further in this, just let me know. But with these 3 topics mainly talking about performance, can Nvidia innovate on the handheld platform? By combining each of these upgrades, a more powerful CPU and GPU, lower render resolutions, and utilizing frame gen to pick up the slack, you're looking at one low-end render floor. Imagine rendering a game at 540p and getting 60 FPS with minuscule additional power consumption. The Switch successor will be an efficiency beast. This efficiency will make the Steam Deck's 10-watt mode and 40-watt-hour battery look like a child. It's entirely feasible for a Nintendo handheld to maintain its 4-ish hours of battery life rocking a 1080p output resolution. Couple that with Nintendo's tweaks, optimizations from Nvidia, and lower-end visual requirements from the games that are on Nintendo, this handheld is sure to impress. But more importantly, this level of performance will enable developers to stop chopping up their games just to run on the Switch, and instead allow them to embrace Nvidia's technologies to fill in the gaps. As a high-end handheld enthusiast, say that 3 times fast, this is all super exciting. And that's all I've got to say about the leaks covering the Nintendo Switch's successor. Let me know down in the comments if I missed anything, or what you're looking forward to from the Switch 2. As always, you guys can reach out to me over on Twitter @TheTurk, and I appreciate y'all sticking to the end of the video. I hope you've had a good one, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.